Good morning. Thank you for attending 2020 Sunstone Digital Symposium, session 333, titled Ethical Approaches to Scholarship About Vulnerable Communities. The audio from this session will be available for purchase at sunstone.org after the symposium. The video recording of this session will be available in the Whova app for the remainder of 2020. Please type your questions into the Whova app to be addressed during the Q&A. At Sunstone, we are making it a goal to build a community that allows many ways for people to express their faith. Our tagline is, "There is more than one way to Mormon." We invite you to help us build a community where all the paths are given space to be better understood. Please support us in our mission by making a donation and subscribing at sunstone.org. About this presentation, Cristina Rosetti will ask the question, who has the authority to speak on behalf of marginalized religious communities in Mormon Studies? Lindsay Hansen Park will speak on the impact of research, advocacy, and scholarship on fundamentalist Mormon communities. I will take just a second to introduce you to our speakers before we begin. Cristina Rosetti has a PhD in religious studies from the University of California, Riverside, and is co-chair of Religion in America, American Academy of Religion, Western Region. Lindsay Hansen Park is the executive director of the Sunstone Education Foundation and the host of the Year of Polygamy podcast. She lives in Salt Lake City with her family. I'll now give the floor to our presenters.
Hi everyone, I'm Lindsay Hansen Park. Thank you for coming to our session today. We're going to be talking about ethical approaches to scholarship. And I am coming to you not as a scholar or a researcher, but as more of an activist and someone who studied different religious groups. And we should have been more specific actually in our title. We're talking about specifically groups that Cristina and I interact with, marginalized religious groups particularly. We don't want to speak for other vulnerable communities, but there's a lot of good data and research that are happening there. So if you are interested in helping or assisting a certain community, you should look into that, and I'll talk more about that in my presentation. But I want to talk about this slide really quick. This presentation is dedicated to our friend Leroy B. Jeffs. And it might seem strange or a little dramatic that we're opening with this picture, but this is Roy as he is now currently. And this is how Cristina and I knew Roy and remembered Roy. I'll show you him. Roy Jeffs is the son of Warren Jeffs, a leader in the FLDS, and he took his life shortly before Sunstone of last year. Now, the reason why we have chosen to dedicate this presentation to him and even use these photos is not to exploit Roy. Roy was exploited plenty in his lived experience, but he wanted to speak to that exploitation. It was very, very painful to him, and he asked us many, many times to do it. And it made both Cristina and I uncomfortable because we didn't know how to approach it, and we didn't know where the boundaries were and what would hurt him and what didn't. But it was for certain that every time we talked about Roy, there were impacts of that. And so we're going to talk about that today. I want to acknowledge that the way that we are talking about Roy now, even though Roy, as you can see, passed away, harm can still be done in the way that we talk about him. Roy has family, he has identity, he has a community that are all impacted by his story. And so as we talk about that, we're going to be aware of that. But we also want to honor Roy as he is to us today. And so this is our friend, Leroy Jeffs. So with that, Christina's going to start, and then I'm going to give my remarks.
All right, so I'm going to share my screen. All right, so like Lindsay mentioned, the idea for this came together when Roy died. He was raised, like Lindsay mentioned, in the FLDS, and he faced significant exploitation when he left. And to be honest, his death changed everything for me. I became really angry, and I actually didn't think I could study Mormonism again. But the anger ended up transforming into a desire for more conversations on the way we study Mormonism and the way we choose to tell stories. So today I want to talk a little bit about my field, which is ethnography of religion, and how it was shaped by its own ethical dilemmas, and present some practical steps for how we study communities ethically and responsibly. And I want to be clear, I don't have all the answers. I'm still learning and I make mistakes all the time. But these are some of the things that I've learned, and I hope that they can raise questions for you and that it will kind of help us engage with the world in a better way. So I'm trained as an ethnographer, and that's a really fancy way of saying that I hang out with people and I write about it. And I want to start with a story that last year I was invited to speak at a university in the South. And I landed at the airport and I was welcomed by a faculty member at the university. She studies Orthodox Christianity, and meaning the churches of the Orthodox churches. And on the drive to the hotel, she asked me about my research and the communities I study. And as I talked, I mentioned the importance of telling these stories and ensuring that history doesn't disappear, especially when it comes to groups that are dwindling in numbers, that aren't part of the historical record. And I happened to be presenting on a fundamentalist Mormon community that currently has about 50 members. So this exact situation. And at a pause in the conversation, she asked, "Don't communities have the right to disappear?" And my head started racing as I thought through the importance of these people that I've spent so much time with, and with the historical record generally, and how I don't want them to go away and I want their story to be told. And with different situations in each community that lead to historical records leaving, I thought, well, whose right is it to determine if they disappear? And at every turn, that wasn't me. Because the people I study aren't my people. I have always been a guest in a world that no one had to invite me into. And while I'm forever grateful for the invitations and the friendships and the canning lessons and the late night conversations and the enchilada casserole, I was always a guest. And when you're a guest in someone's home, you make sure that you don't throw it into upheaval when you leave. So this professor's question brought me back to my first methods course in grad school and learning the fraught history of my chosen field. When we dig into the history of ethnography, which for those who don't know is a subfield of anthropology, cultural anthropology specifically, the ethical concerns that shaped the field really come to the forefront of the conversation. Of course, this is only more complicated when we're talking about historically marginalized communities. Anthropology gained a foothold at the turn of the century when, big quotes, qualified people were sent out to describe the other. Usually this took shape in descriptions of the primitive, big quotes again, the savage and the different. As we now understand and hopefully implement in our own research, these communities were only other in relationship to that which was not other, namely the West. Anthropology became the means of mapping, museums, and storytelling. It became the way for the Western world to put other people on display and tell their stories for them. It was, from the beginning, a colonial endeavor. As James Clifford notes, the stories and displays assumed the need to preserve for preservation, redemption, and representation. Embedded in that assumption was the idea that the community themselves wasn't capable of those endeavors. So these are two great books written by the same person, James Clifford, that kind of go into detail on the ethics of ethnographic methods. And I can't recommend them enough if you're interested in kind of learning the deeper history of how ethnography and anthropology were colonial practices, and unpacking how we talk about people. I really recommend these two books highly. So the history of anthropology is the history of attempting to shed light on cultural difference. Ethnographies of areas that are close to us and of the everyday are actually fairly new. So when we talk about ethnographies of, there's a lot of ethnographies of Appalachia, there's a lot of ethnographies of inner cities, and that idea of studying close communities is really new. Usually it was people in their anthropology hats going out and talking about people that weren't white. But in the recent years, so we still kind of engage in old tropes, and it's going away slowly in anthropology, but the hope is to include stories that are closer to home. But even in the early years, when trying to talk about closer to home stories, the old trope was still part of the field. And this even included visitors to Utah who wrote about Mormons as strange and distant, even though they were actually very close to people in California who were visiting to see them. In his book on Mormon interactions with the railroad and secularism, David Walker gave readers a look at the Cape Connor, which was a steamboat that took Gentile excursionists along the Jordan River through the distant, novel, and mystical land of Utah. The way Utah was written about was no different. It was written about as far away and distant and weird. And embedded within that was this idea that the people who were writing about them were somehow better or more educated. And as an ethnographer, my task is to disrupt the easy narratives of difference. The work of the ethnographic storyteller, as the old couplet goes, is to make the strange familiar and the familiar strange. What I mean by that is finding what anthropologists call the internal logics of the community. This is how the community makes sense of their world and then acts accordingly. So for me, I don't simply tell people that Mormons practice polygamy. That's actually really easy to do. The hard task is to explain why Mormons practice polygamy. And I don't just mean another exposition on 132, and I don't mean just a more regurgitation of pioneer narratives. I mean really explaining why. And for me, I've kind of come into a place where I'm not willing to explain away practices anymore. So people ask me all the time, for example, why women convert to fundamentalism, why women join polygamous communities. And I've come to a place where the only answer I can give is because they believe. And to be honest for that community, that has to be the answer sometimes. So it's coming to a place of really explaining why. In my field, finding out those answers is called fieldwork, and it only comes from spending a lot of time in a community. As my advisor, Amanda Lucia, referred to it, fieldwork as deep hanging out. So fieldwork is learning the language of people without trying to measure things. We all participate in feigned objectivity and the idea that we can determine value. But finding the internal logics means removing the need to measure and sitting with the discomfort that stems from avoiding that need. Finding internal logics also means suspending our disbelief. It means even for a moment pausing to wonder what happens if the people we're studying are right. And more than that, sitting in the possibility that they are. And by possibility, I often mean discomfort, of sitting in the discomfortability that maybe where you're coming from, maybe your background, maybe your worldview is wrong or not right. Maybe these people are. And what happens to our scholarship when we approach it that way? So I get asked all the time how I get access to various communities and how I get invited to church all the time. And there's two kind of answers to that. First, I was willing to go. My best friend Daisy joked once that she couldn't remember a time where I declined an invitation to church. And that's true. I was willing to spend a lot of time with communities, and I was willing to suspend my disbelief when I went. And similarly, in suspending my disbelief, what I mean by that practically, I wrote a dissertation on Mormons who speak to the dead. And I remember the first time someone looked at me and said, "Oh, I do that." And there's two key choices I could have made in that moment. I could have thought it was weird and said, "Of course you do," and rolled my eyes. Or I could have asked what the dead have to say. My greatest encouragement is to always choose that second option. Not only is trust gained, but you'll tell a better story if you take what people are saying at face value and not try to unpack it and prove it wrong. So in choosing the second option, I chose to make that which was deemed strange more familiar. And at the same time, I had to kind of unpack my own ideas about the world. So when I walk into a community, I undoubtedly change the field. People will often ask if communities alter their religious services when I'm there, which is a fair question, and the answer is maybe. But ethnographers are called to spend at least a year in their community. And at some point, people aren't going to alter things for you because you're not the center of anything in their life, really. But things still change, including you. Too often, the idea of qualified persons studying a community remains the dominant narrative, even unknowingly. And to that, it's important to ask the ways in which you change because of the work you do. So this picture was taken when I went with a group of young fundamentalists to the cathedral in Salt Lake City. And here's a great example of what I mean. As we walked into the cathedral, one of them looked at me and with wide eyes and said, "Aren't there dead people's bodies in here?" And the table had flipped. He thought my beliefs were strange. He thought I was weird. And I was different. And there's a way to tell the story of relics and the long history that Catholics have of preserving the dead. There's a way to make that story familiar. But in that moment, I was strange. And to me, those are the moments that are most important in my work, and the most important for scholars who study marginalized communities are the moments when we have to pause and remember that difference and strangeness is not that far from us, that difference and strangeness is often us. So it's in these moments that when the table is flipped, that we come to terms with the reality of the qualified person writing about the other. And it's in these moments where we see that we have limitations to our ways of knowing. And this limitation encourages a reconsideration of the question of who has the right to tell people's stories. And the answer, uncomfortably, is not you. We don't have the right to speak for people. We never did. Rather, we have been invited into people's homes and lives and given the gift of participation. And as such, there's a responsibility to tell stories fairly and to tell them well. And then there's times when it's not our jobs to tell the stories. Rather, there are moments when our time and the tools we acquire are better used to empower members of the community to tell their own stories. Power dynamics in anthropology are complicated for this reason. On one hand, marginalized communities get wider audiences and the broader community learns from them when someone with a platform and an educational background tells their story. However, there are moments when this platform can be better used to offer people the equipment to tell those stories. If someone wants to tell the story for themselves, it is our responsibility to help them do that the best we can. We don't get to just take things from people. So practically, what's kind of some practical tools that we have? So I mentioned power imbalance a few times. So it's important to recognize that there's an inherent imbalance in studying and writing about a community of people. If you have the education, the writing skills, the audience, you have a form of power that many people don't have. And so it's important to recognize that, but also be in conversation with the community you're writing about. What representation matters to them? Would this be better served having them tell this story? And you using your platform to strengthen those voices. So that's kind of something that needs to constantly be in the back of our mind. The other thing is consent. You have to ask people if you can tell their story, if you can write about them. So in my process, I'll talk a little bit about IRB and the Institutional Review Board. So for me, when I was writing my big project, I had to go through what's called institutional review. And it's an outside body of ethics people who read your proposal, read what you're doing, and decide if it's an ethical project, and they'll make revisions. My IRB went through 8 rounds of revision, and most of it dealt with consent, because since I was going to religious communities and spending time in church, there was really no way to ask every single person to sign a consent form. And so in my case, I talked to leaders of the community, different communities. Everyone knew I was there. There was only one instance where someone raised concern about my presence, and that was talked through. But within the idea of consent, it's important to interrogate the cost and the benefit of that consent. What cost to the community happens if they consent to your work, and what benefit comes to the community? I spelled benefit wrong, and I'm sorry. So it's important to examine what's gained and what's lost. Within consent, children are really hard to get ethical consent for, because they can't consent, as we know. And so parents, for children's studies, parents often will do that, but the scope of what you can ask has to change when you're talking about children. The other one that a lot of people don't think about are people in prison. People in prison have been historically exploited for research, everything from giving diseases to people to forcing their participation in surveys. So that's kind of a messy one. And then in a lot of the communities that Lindsay and I are talking about, a lot of these people are historically criminalized. And so what does it mean to offer consent if you're someone who is a criminal? And so kind of thinking through what consent means in a broader scope than just they said I could talk to them. Really thinking through what happens when they say yes, what happens when they participate. If I tell someone's story and they end up, losing their children because they're polygamous people, that's on me. And so really thinking through the entire scope of what happens when you write about someone. Relatedly, coercion. Obviously, avoid coercion always. Tell people what you're writing about and researching about in the most honest way. Our research changes all the time. So when I went into the field, I had kind of a general set of questions, but I of course didn't know what I was going to find. And as I found more things and the questions changed, I had to continually go back to the people I was working with and say, these are the new questions. This is what I'm doing now. Is that still okay, right? This is a process. But the other thing with coercion is making promises to people, offering something in exchange. So for example, if you're working with a homeless population and you're offering food or shelter, are they only participating for that? And is that coercive? So thinking through why people are participating and how you got that participation is really important. The other thing is spending time. So like I mentioned, anthropologists are kind of encouraged to spend at least a year. My advisor told me the importance of spending all the seasons with a community of people, that you can't really know a group unless you've been with them for every season. We gain nothing from telling people stories before we really know the story. So if I go in with just my general questions that I had, but and then spent a week and then wrote something based on those questions in that week-long period, we've really gained nothing. Without time spent, we're left with old stereotypes, we're left with tropes, and those usually do more harm than good. And oftentimes that's where re-traumatization can happen, especially if you're writing about communities that are in very vulnerable positions at that moment. And then the last thing is institutional review. So even if you're not part of a institution or an academic organization or anything like that, IRB, there's a national organization, and you can go on the IRB website. If you have a university close to you, the IRB at that university probably has a website. And I would highly recommend you check out what they're talking about. What are their guidelines? Like I mentioned, there's very specific guidelines for working with imprisoned populations. And you can read through everything that entails, everything dealing with children. And see kind of what those conversations are happening. IRB is not necessarily a perfect institution, but and it was actually created for medical purposes, because there's a long history of the medical profession testing on vulnerable populations. And so that's a lot of the questions kind of deal with that, but I would still recommend checking out their guidelines and learn the specifics of what's happening and what anthropologists are talking about in terms of ethics. So in closing, in 2015, Jeremy McLean wrote the introduction to a methodology book called Exotic No More, and it's on the shift in anthropology and the way forward and how we can continue to be anthropologists while recognizing the fraught ethical history of our field and recognizing the importance of storytelling. And he opened with a line that has shaped my work and continues to inform everything I do. And he said that anthropology means taking people seriously. As we move forward in the world, it is my hope that we can be informed by this call that we do not first seek to save or rescue or get people out of something or make people feel weird, but that we can first seek to take people seriously. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. I hope you guys can hear me okay. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen as well. Just one moment. Okay, I am going to speak on some of the impacts that we have witnessed from the research, the scholarship, the reporting, the journalism that has been done in the communities that we study. As we talked about earlier, we're dedicating this presentation to Roy Jeffs, and though it's been a little over a year since his suicide, I have been contemplating ways to tell his story. Roy was very practiced at telling a specific story about his life, and there was another story that Roy was trying to tell, and none of us knew how to tell it at the time because it was such a complicated story. But I think that I have a way that I can start to tell the story, and hopefully, like Roy wanted it to have, let it have a broader impact and make us rethink the way that we tell and share and study and learn about each other. So I'm going to start with this essay at first. It's called To Hell with Good Intentions, and I don't know if you've read about this. It's about an Austrian philosopher, Ivan Illich, who he did something really brave. This is actually from the 1960s. He was asked to speak to a student group who they go to, particularly in Mexico, but into the global South as white Americans, and go and help rescue different communities. They build orphanages and they build water lines and things like that. And so he came to speak, and his entire speech to the student group was telling them to basically disband their organization. He pointed out the hypocrisy and the danger in what they're doing. And I would definitely recommend this essay, even though it is old. It was written in the 60s, and a lot of the practices have changed and been updated. Many have not. And I think it's a very good starting point into when we're interacting with other communities. And basically the gist is this. He finds it incredibly offensive that white Americans will go down into different countries to help the poor, right? To take pictures, what he calls charity tourism, where people go on vacation to basically interact and engage with someone else's lived poverty, lived oppression. We go, we take the pictures, we feel like we're helping, we feel good, and then we go back to our lives. And how complicated and dangerous that can be, and the impacts of that. And Cristina has already talked about responsible ways to do this, but the impacts on this can be long lasting. He related it to the fact of, in America in the 60s, as America now, we have many problems. We have many communities that need our help, including our own, probably our own. And how offensive would it be if people came up from Mexico to fix us because they thought the way we were living was wrong? And it's a great essay for your consideration. I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience working with these fundamentalist communities and with Roy Jeffs. I've talked about this before on my podcast, but as there I am on the screen as a cute little Mormon mommy. I was serving in the Young Women's at the time, and I had read a book that described some of the atrocities that were happening in Congo, the DRC. I had never heard of Congo before. I was one of those people that thought maybe Africa was a country. I didn't know anything about it, but I knew that the things that were happening over there were bad, and I wanted to help. My intentions were good, as they say. So my friend and I, Missy, we started an organization called Utah for Congo, where we would host 5K runs and raise money for post-rape survivors in Congo. And as I started to do that, I remember our first race, I wanted to put up photos of, very tragic photos of women from Africa in harrowing positions. I didn't even check to see if the women were from Congo. I didn't check to understand what was happening. I just did a Google image search and found, you know, photos of people suffering in Africa, and I brought them to Missy, and she was like, "What are you doing? You can't do that." And I was like, no, this is what, you know, this is what we're trying to help. And she recommended this book to me. It's called King Leopold's Ghosts. And I would absolutely recommend it to everyone, not just because as it relates to Congo, but as it relates to how we engage in our world globally. It radically changed my life. It's the history of the colonization of Congo from basically the aftermath of what has happened from the help that white Europeans gave. And the idea that King Leopold of Belgium was able to go and colonize and steal all of the resources through incredible violence, incredible torture, incredible slavery. And he convinced them to do it under missionary work. He sold a story of the poor Black African and, you know, the story of their terrible poverty. And it horrified people, good, well-meaning, well-intentioned people. White European women formed unions, little sewing circles and book clubs, and they wanted to help save these poor savages. And as I was reading the book, I realized that was me. I was that. This book held up a mirror for me. I was doing that. I had never gone over there. I could barely tell you where Congo was on a map. I didn't know the history. All I saw was the poor Black African, and my help could do incredible harm. Giving money to the wrong organizations, to the wrong people in a country who has been destabilized by colonization. The only reason Congo is in the mess that it is in today is because of the help of good intentions, and the history tells that. So that was a huge mirror for me, and I realized that it was irresponsible of me to be helping a place that I had never I didn't understand, and people I didn't know. And now listen, I'm not trying to discourage people from helping. There are ways to research ethical organizations, but almost all organizations have flaws, as that essay, To Hell with Good Intentions, explains. When you're coming in with the idea, the position that you're up here and they are down here and they need your help, the power imbalance is already set. And that can be a very, very dangerous thing. So that moves on to what got me involved in my own community. So I first started with the LDS community. I started a podcast on the history of polygamy, thinking that it was an LDS experience, learning that it's not just an LDS experience. It's, you know, brought into a lot of different Mormon groups. And this is how I got involved with the FLDS. Now, like Cristina mentioned, it's not that outsiders can't study other groups or can't be with other groups. It's just that it's essential that you recognize where you position. We always talk about privilege arguments. The word privilege is so fraught and so loaded now and so politicized, but really privilege theory is simple. Privilege theory is only trying to tell you where you situate in relationship to other people, right? And so I knew, because I'd learned from the Congo situation, that I was an outsider, and yet we had a common language of Mormonism. So I felt like that there was enough intersection that I could responsibly engage with the community. But because I recognized myself as an outsider, I didn't want to lead the way. I wasn't going to go in and say, your community is flawed, here is how we fix it. Because let's be honest, none of us have our lives figured out. We all want to rescue someone and get them out of, you know, terrible things. Sex trafficking is a big discussion right now, as if we are assuming that where we are bringing the people is safer than where they were. And because of our ignorance, we always assume that's the case. And it's not, as I'll illustrate. So our first year, my first involvement, this was years ago, was a police rally in Short Creek, which is the headquarters where the FLDS reside. I knew enough to not go in and say, here's how we're going to help, here's what we're going to do. Instead, I met with community leaders that were living there underground or had been there in resistance to Warren Jeffs and the FLDS. And I said, I want to help. I have a lot of people asking to help. What do you need? And that is how we've engaged our work down there. They tell us what they need. We give them the resources to do it. And so the first year was they wanted to hold a rally against the police. We had one of our volunteers, Andrew Chatwin, who lives and comes from the community, had just recently gotten a legal lease on property that we were going to go fix up as volunteers. That's what they initially asked us to do. And instead, the FLDS, who ran the police department down there, arrested him for trespassing. And so they asked us to come down and hold a rally against the police. They called it a rally. They were afraid to call it a protest. They had never done anything like that before, and everyone was too afraid to do it. So what they needed from us was to bring volunteers. We brought down 75 volunteers, and we gave them the signs. The FLDS, who were too scared to say their opinions, wrote on the signs, and our volunteers went and stood by proxy. And that led to an effort that allowed them to have the courage to work to decertify their police, which in turn helped them get a legitimate election. They elected Danya Jessup as mayor. It empowered the leaders who were already doing things, who understood their own community to do the work that they needed. And so for me, that was an example of successful help. We came and stood with them in what they needed, but we didn't lead the way. We just gave them the resources. And that comes to me talking about Shirley Draper. Shirley Draper is another person from this community that I want you to see. You saw Roy Jess, you saw his headstone. His story is not how we want them to end. But Shirley Draper is someone I consider a leader in not only in talking about these communities in Mormonism, but in all marginalized communities, especially isolated ones. Shirley Draper is leading the way. She is a credentialed expert. And because of where she comes from, because she grew up in the FLDS, and because she was a sister wife, she lived polygamy, often people dismiss her. And I think that that's a mistake to do so. In fact, I think that she should be she's one of the pioneers in this space, and she's truly gifted. Right now, she's the director of operations of an organization called Cherished Families. And so we have shifted our support in town for her support for her organization, because what has happened is Shirley left the FLDS as a plural wife. She had to abandon for a time her children to do so. It was a hard thing. She had to abandon her sister wife, who she loved. And she went to school and got education and came back and brought those gifts back to her town. And now she runs an organization called Cherished Families, which is run in Short Creek by folks who are trained, who have cultural competency, and who have ties with the community and know what they're doing. And so we direct a lot of our support there, because Shirley knows better than many people how and what this community needs, and ways to do it that aren't damaging. And I want to talk about the impact a little bit. This is something that Shirley Draper said. There was an effort to get polygamy decriminalized, which Cristina was lead on. I was able to help with that as well. We worked with Shirley Draper and Cherished Families and Alina Darger on this effort. And she wrote sort of her own manifesto, because as Shirley was going to advocate to get polygamy decriminalized, she took so much heat for it. Shirley Draper is out of the church. She is atheist. She doesn't like polygamy. She doesn't like marriage. And yet she found herself being talked about over and over and over as if she wasn't in the room, as if, painting this idea of polygamy, all polygamists are suffering, all polygamists are bad, all polygamists need to be rescued. That was a very painful thing for her. And so she got upset a little bit, hearing that over and over. So she just wrote a private manifesto, and with her permission, she allowed me to quote from it. She said, "My fears of the outside world were compounded by the exploitation I constantly saw of others who had left the religion, who were commoditized and exploited by anti-polygamy crusaders who trafficked in their misery, made them go on television and say horrible things about their families, much of which was untrue, in order to be worthy of assistance. I saw how this deeply wounded the family they left behind. I knew I would be unwilling to be used in that way, so when I resolved to leave, I had no one to turn to for help." What Shirley is talking about is that at the time she left the FLDS, at the time when she did need resources and help, she didn't feel like there were any appropriate avenues to do so, because she had seen over and over people that left be exploited. Typically the story in groups like this, and in Mormon fundamentalist groups, when you leave, it's such a horror story because you left a polygamous group. So everyone wants to put you on TV, tell your story, right? And the idea is, who is benefiting from that? Well, the people who are telling the stories, the podcaster who's telling the stories, gets the downloads. The news agency that does the interview gets the views. What does the person telling the story get out of it? Usually nothing but pain and anger and disruption in their lives. Their family will turn against them. Their community will reject them, or, you know, they'll be contacted by predatory people over and over and over. And that's what happened to our friend Roy Jeffs. So Roy Jeffs was rescued by an evangelical organization with good intentions, trying to help him. Oh, I'm going to show you that in just a minute. He wanted so badly to help his family. He wanted so badly to save his family. His mother, his dear mother, is still in the FLDS. He spent the majority of his time out looking for her and trying to connect with her. And he was put on camera right out the gate. And Roy was dealing with some things that I think the rescue organizations were very unequipped to deal with. The two avenues for helping people right now continued in the community, with the exception of organizations like Cherish Families, are evangelical groups that are trying to rescue Mormons from Mormonism, and LDS people who are trying to convert the fundamentalists from the bad Mormonism to the good Mormonism. And the problem with that, as Cristina talked about, is you're incentivizing a path. You're putting conditions on assistance. And when you do that, it will impact the way that people respond to both the conditions and the help. And Roy found himself in that position. He was very vulnerable. He was 18. He didn't know anything about the outside world. He'd grown up in a very isolated community. And we just assumed that it was better and safer for him out here than it was in his experience. And I would say it wasn't. The world out here is treacherous, especially when you've never been taught boundaries, especially when you don't have any healthy sexual scripts, any truth, scientific information, no working information about how laws work or how society works. All of that was warped for him in the FLDS. And so he lived a very sheltered life in so many ways. And when he was rescued, the assumption is, now that you're out, you're good, you're free. We'll get you some therapy and that'll be it. But that is not what Roy experienced. And I often say Roy was more traumatized by his experience leaving the FLDS than he ever was by the FLDS. Roy survived the FLDS. In fact, most of his experiences, if, you know, terrible and hard to hear, a lot of them were pleasant. He remembers playing, you know, basketball with his family, with his dad. He loved his father. He experienced his father in a very different way than other people did. And there was no room or discourse for him to unpack that or untangle that when he came out there. He just had to sign up for the assumption that everybody had, which was his father was terrible. The FLDS were terrible. It was oppressive. It was a cult. And aren't you glad that you left it? And I saw him try to agree with that, and it ate him up inside. I saw him conflicted constantly. Roy spent many, many nights crying on my couch because people were forcing him to choose between two identities. And that's what I've talked about has really informed my work at Sunstone, this idea more than one way to Mormon. I think it's essential that when people leave high stakes religions or they transition out of a faith, that they are allowed to claim parts of that faith and tradition that meant something to them. If we paint one thing as all black, then what we've done is we've turned it into a caricature that doesn't represent the actual truth. We've seen that in all of the examples I used before. And King Leopold was able to successfully do that, sell a story of horror that opened for many more horrors than anyone could ever have imagined. And that was through the rescue. And we are seeing that in these communities because, again, the assumption is it's so much better out here. And the world is hard. It is not better or worse. It's just different. And so there are ways that we have to prepare people. If we go with the assumption that our world is safe and their world is not, or our world is better and their world is not, we are doing damage. And so just like I said, with recognizing where your privilege is, you have to recognize where your flaws are too. it bothers me to no end the way that the LDS tries to distance themselves, and other Mormon fundamentalists try to distance themselves from folks like Warren Jeffs and the FLDS. They want to say, we're not different, we're not different, we're not different. Well, what about the ways we are the same? Because there are a lot, and that can be a starting point where we can learn lessons. So weapons, so faith can be turned into a tool, not a weapon. So we can avoid situations like people needing to be rescued. And yet we haven't made a lot of progress on that front. I want to show you an example. When I first went, this is a video when I first went down to Short Creek. One of my first engagements, they were building a wall. It was, the faithful boys were building a wall around the chapel. And I just want to show you just a little clip of this really quick.
Oh, they wait. They're friendly too. I know, I love them. What is this? What's this right here? No, it's an orange light, so it's construction. Okay. It's red and blue, then we gotta run. No, because we're on a public fish road. Yeah. I don't know if it's yeah. Just getting their marks in order. No, I have to wave at everyone.
Okay, I wanted to show you that because that was, I went with Sam Brower. They were filming the building of this 9-foot wall over their chapel. And it was mostly young boys, and so that's why Sam Brower was documenting it. But as there were a few of us that were experiencing it for the first time, and so I felt a sense that there was a way to sort of amp up and escalate what was happening so we could get some good footage. And I remember thinking that that was kind of strange. And so we would get closer and closer with our cameras. If you notice in that video, there are a ton of cars driving by. Short Creek is not like that. It's not that busy. But that particular day, because we were filming, FLDS sort of rallied around what was happening. And I want you to understand how disruptive and strange it must be to be doing something, a church project, and having strangers come who you were told are outsiders, start filming you, getting closer and closer and closer, egging you on, trying to get good footage. And that was sort of my first encounter. And sure enough, the dance began to happen. Cars would pull up, try to run us over. I didn't ever feel like we were in actual danger. Those cars driving by had little kids flipping the bird. And it was kind of exciting, right? It was like, oh, what is happening? There's this show. But now I know many of those kids. I have several footage of that video, of that time building that fence. And seeing those kids work at that, building that, I had such stigmas and stereotypes and pity for them. And now I know most of them because they're out, and we've had conversations, and they remember when we were filming, and they were just telling how humiliating it was. They already knew that they were sort of stuck in this situation, and here we were mocking them. It made us less safe to reach out to. It made them think, why would we want to go there? Those people are unkind. Those people are mean. And so I think that we wound our own research and work. And most importantly, I think that the majority of the people that have gone and told stories down there go and tell a story, and then they leave the community with that impact. They go and tell a story of lost boys, and then the people who are the lost boys live with that. I talked to my friend Heather Cook, and she said, lost boys, why do we keep saying that? I was 10 when I ran away. Where are we including the girls in this situation? And it wasn't all how we see it on documentaries. And so Cristina and I both get frustrated in the way that it tells the stories, not because we want to hide under the rug the bad things, but we need to be able to give communities stories of redemption too within their own spaces. And that includes our own LDS community and all the other fundamentalist places. If we make things so black and white, it will do damage. Shirley Draper filed this for the amendment that she was trying to pass. She talked about how that stigma led to more suffering in their community, how that judgment, that preconceived notion that they need help and they need to be rescued actually did more damage. It compounded the damage. She talks about how when the raid came to come help and rescue these people in 1953, that left a huge wound on the community that still exists, that has made certain families and people build up walls and that protects abuse, that hides abuse even further. Warren Jeffs was able to have the power and control that he had because of the narratives of people like us. So when I say that we are complicit in what happened with the FLDS, I'm specifically talking to the Utah culture and the LDS culture who have continually distanced ourselves and continue to marginalize and stigmatize groups like this. Because the reality is, not every family in the FLDS are abused, just like not every family in the LDS are abused. You don't see people going into LDS homes trying to rescue them. I mean, we do see some evangelicals and we know how irritating that is. But what we do see is a lot of LDS taking pity on the FLDS and wanting to change them. Why would you want to bring them into a group that also has sexual abuse? The LDS has sexual abuse, drug addiction, so many issues with sexual narratives. Why is that better? Why are we thinking that's better just because that's what we're used to? And so the impact for us was that we lost one of our dear friends, Roy Jeffs. I mean, he couldn't handle truly the idea of, he couldn't reconcile being his father's son in this world, having to carry the weight of that in his own community. He paid the price for being a Jeffs, and he paid a worse one being a Jeffs outside, because with that, the stigma, the knowledge of his abuse followed him everywhere. Every time he told his story, it opened him up to very predatory people who would contact him from all over the country. And the people who were telling his story didn't have to deal with any of that impact. And so as you tell these stories and research communities and help amplify the voices, I would say let them tell their stories, but also make sure they're the ones that are benefiting, whether it's in knowledge or trade or money. If you can pay them, pay them. They should be able to benefit from their stories as well. And I don't see that happening hardly ever. So now I think we're going to open it up to Q&A. Is that right?
If you're ready.
Tina?
You might need to unmute, Christina. There you go. We have several questions. The first one is, as a white woman trying to work alongside marginalized populations, I'm always trying to be conscious of ways I accidentally center myself and try to fix that. How can we best work to refocus attention on the voices that need it while using our privilege to point them out? Do you have experiences with practicing this that you can share?
Do you want to cover that, Christina?
Yeah, so I'm a white woman too. The communities I study are also white, and I actually have talked about this quite a bit in that a lot of fundamentalist communities continue to practice doctrinal racism. So being white, of course, is a privilege to be able to study these communities. So I want to start by saying that. In ensuring that we're not centering ourselves, I think one of the big things is in communities that are underrepresented, but are also trying to tell their own stories. That's where it comes in to ensure, if you want to ensure you're not centering yourself, take yourself out of it. Don't tell stories that you are not qualified to tell. Don't tell stories that other people are trying to tell. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. And so if you have the tools to help people tell their stories, and it's a community that has been trying to do that historically and has been unable to, a key way to decenter yourself is to help educate and give the tools for them to do it themselves. Don't take credit for people's stories. I think that's the first and biggest way to ensure you're decentering yourself.
And I would just like to say, pay attention to whose stories you're telling. As a white woman, I have since learned with the embarrassing Utah for Congo experience that it is not my place to tell those stories, but I can amplify them for sure. And so I would say you find the leaders in these communities who are doing this work, and you amplify and support them and their work. Especially in my community as Mormons, we all want to take charge and be in charge. I've seen this, especially, no offense, with Mormon men. We call it, I should have been a general authority syndrome, where, you know, your whole life you're like trained to be a leader, and leadership can only happen to a small few. And so men just naturally want to lead in our community. And I would say we let those who are supposed to lead the communities lead them, and it's not always us. And so instead of leading all the time, learn to walk with people, learn to meet them where they're at, learn to not judge them. I have had to adjust so much of my thinking working with FLDS, so much of it, because the culture, even though I think so much of it is the same. I mean, Roy and I we would go running or walking and we would sing primary songs because we both knew that's just our shared language. But there are things that I didn't know. I didn't understand, for example, that the community is very adverse to what they call the victim mentality. It's very important to them to not be seen as victims of Warren Jeffs, right? And I don't think I realized how deep that there's a cultural strain. And I'm not saying that that's a healthy thing, but that's a thing that I've had to learn to respect. And I've been there for years, and I'm still been in that community for years, and I'm still learning. I'm still an outsider in so many ways. And so, yeah, our job is just to amplify, like Fatima Saleh says, step in front up first and then step aside. Sometimes you step in front with your privilege and open a door, but then it's not for you to keep doing that. You step aside and let other people step through that and give them platform. That's how I'd answer that question.
Thank you. This next question is related, but from a slightly different perspective. As a minority sect that is sometimes studied, including by the panelists, do you have any advice about establishing healthy boundaries? How can we be open and authentic without being exploited?
Yeah. So I know the person that wrote this in the community. So, and I've spent time there. So the first thing I would say is that no is a complete sentence. That you can tell people no to studying you. You can tell people no to going into specific spaces. So for example, if you have a temple, you can absolutely say no, that this is not a space for you. You can establish actual physical boundaries of you can't come here. In terms of if you're working with an anthropologist or an ethnographer, absolutely come forward and ask, can I read the drafts? That's something that absolutely you have the right to see how people are writing about you. You can withdraw your consent at any time. And invitations are revocable. If someone comes to church and it's not working out, you have the right to say you can't come back, or you have to leave. And so I think the big thing is just standing in your ground of this is my community and this is my family and I'm going to protect them, and you can tell people to leave at any time.
And I would also say, as a Mormon woman who grew up with hardly any boundaries, boundaries have been very, very hard for me to learn and to practice. I'm still learning to practice those. I remember I learned this lesson with Roy because I thought I was being responsible when I gave Roy a platform on my podcast, because at the time the thinking was, tell your story, that'll help people, it'll get out and bring awareness. And Roy said yes to everything. Mm-hmm. And I started to notice that pattern. I was like, Roy, you don't always have to tell. He did every interview that came his way, and we're like, you don't have to do that, because every time he would do that, like I said, predatory people would come out of the works. And I'm not kidding. Like he was catfished like 3 times when we knew him. He sent money to a bot who he thought was a girlfriend via text. He didn't understand how that worked. He wasn't dumb. He was just very unaware of things that we've sort of culturally grown up with. And Roy told me, I said, Roy, why are you doing all this? It's hard for you. It re-traumatizes you every time you tell your story. And he said, well, we were taught to obey upon a suggestion, which meant that his dad would always give suggestions and they would have to obey what they thought he meant. And so I would say Mormons in general, we're very prone to wanting to say yes and to people please, but we also have this other aspect, which I think is really pernicious, that we need to work at culturally within our own groups, which is we need to paint a good face. We want good PR. We spend, in my culture, so much money and time and energy on how we appear to people, how we appear to be happy. And so there's a huge concern, and any researcher studying us should understand this and realize that it's inherent in all of us. We want to give you our best face. And I know that's not just a Mormon thing, that's a human thing, but that absolutely happens. And how you respond to us will depend on how we respond to you. It's just like, you know, when we talk about in victims advocacy, when someone is disclosing something to you, you don't react. You react as neutrally as possible at first, because depending on how you react, like, oh no, that's so terrible, I'm so sorry that happened to you, or that didn't happen, people will shift their story to be heard. It's just what humans do. And so we have to have better ways to listen and to understand, but also in our own communities, we have to be a little bit brave and try to be a little bit more honest about how we tell our stories, because there are impacts to hiding and putting on the best face as well.
Our time is up. We have a number of questions that we didn't get to today. This conversation can be continued in the community chat boards. Thank you both so much for your powerful presentations. And everybody have a wonderful rest of the symposium. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.